Hey guys, Will here. So I wanted to take an opportunity to address something that has been on my mind for a very long time now, and I've kind of been shying away from talking about this simply because it's a really difficult thing to articulate. It's full of nuance, and with my anxiety and stuff, I'm just never really good at doing this. But it is something that's important, and it's something that I think needs to be addressed. And I'm choosing to do this now, not because of any particular incident, not because of any one content creator or anything that's happened. So the last thing I want to have happen as a result of this video is for anything to sort of turn into a witch hunt or anything like that, because that's absolutely not the case. But yeah, I'm choosing to do the video now simply because we're coming into the ADAC conference, the Big Sim Racing Expo in Germany in the next couple of days. And there's going to be a lot of hype. There's going to be a lot of content creators making videos of all sorts of different nature. And it's a time that it's very easy to get caught up in the hype and maybe spend money that you shouldn't be spending, maybe get sucked into a new product that you don't really need, and so forth. So I wanted to talk today about the nature of reviews and content on YouTube in general around the tech space, and particularly as it relates to sim racing, because obviously that's my area of expertise. And just share some of my thoughts for your consideration, basically, open up the discussion. This is something that comes up in discussion, particularly on Reddit, quite frequently. I haven't seen any discussion about it for quite some time myself, but it kind of comes around every so often, and I just feel like it's a good time to be talking about it at the moment. So one of my big concerns in making this video, and something that I'm always conscious of, because I know that sometimes I can come across that way in interactions, is I don't want this to seem like I'm trying to gatekeep or get on a high horse or preach from some sort of moral high ground here. I do things the way I do them, other people do them the way they do them, and that's absolutely fine. There's room for everybody. I'm not suggesting that my way is the way and everybody else should do it the way I do. What I'm going to be suggesting here is purely just that the way people go about their business needs to be maybe a little bit clearer than it has been historically as the industry grows. So yeah, not trying to preach here, not trying to get on a high horse. The reason I'm doing this is because it's genuinely something that I'm concerned about for the industry that I'm so passionate about. Now, I'm not going to get into my particular review policies in this video. I made a video years and years ago now, 5 years ago, I think, maybe even 6 years ago, titled "How Boosted Media Makes Money and Why it Matters." There's a video and a written article which I keep updated, and I would definitely recommend, if that is something, not only if it's something that you're interested in, but if you are ever influenced in any way by any of our review content, I beg you to actually go through and digest that content so you understand exactly. We always try to put as much disclosure at the start of every review video as you possibly can. That's one of the things I'm going to talk about in today's video. But for the wider context there, unless we were going to make every single video 20 minutes longer, it is important that you guys that watch the channel regularly and are influenced by the things that we say are aware of all our policies and the way we do things and why we do things the way we do. So yeah, I'm not going to get bogged down in that in today's video, but look, where to start with this? So the review industry for sim racing specifically has changed a lot in the last 6 or 7 years. I started about 7 years ago at this point. October 2018 was when I did my first review, I think. So yeah, pretty much bang on 7 years. And so those of you who are OGs on the channel remember it used to be a channel about project cars and making videos about those. Then we moved across into my other passion, which was building high-end computers, water cooling setups, and so forth. And then I started to get into sim racing for a variety of reasons, which I've shared previously. And I was really enjoying kind of making videos about the hardware that I was buying. And as you guys are aware, I do have a background in engineering and adult education. So I was actually a content creator producing training videos for Sony Electronics here in Australia. So I did have a background in communicating products, technical communication, I guess you could say. So I had a bit of a look at what was going on in the space, and I saw that there was a bit of an opportunity. At the time, there was only really a few other channels that were really reviewing stuff at a large scale. You had Sim Racing Garage was probably the biggest one. Inside Sim Racing had actually just stopped making videos right at the time that I was getting into it. So it actually worked in my favor quite well. I remember John did that sort of closing video where he was talking about closing up the channel or ending his involvement with the channel. And Darren has rebooted it a couple of times. He's just rebooted it again recently, which is really great to see. And obviously I wish them every success. So yeah, there's a couple of small channels run by people that were just sort of doing it as a hobby or maybe a side job, and maybe earning enough of an income just to sort of be self-sufficient. So the income from the channel would be enough to pay for the products that they were using and reviewing. But as far as I'm aware, at least, and do correct me if I'm wrong, I think I was the first person to actually be able to turn it into a something that was able to support my family, and then later on my brother Tom's family as well, who you guys see on the channel, and he's usually behind the camera, although he's actually in Germany at the moment for the Sim Racing Expo, so you might see him there. And look, I'm certainly not saying that to try and brag or flex or anything like that. I hope it doesn't come across that way, but I am proud of the fact that I was able to achieve that, and that I do receive a lot of messages from other people that are getting into content creation that straight up tell me that what I've been able to do has inspired them to do the same kind of thing in their own way, of course. And nobody's trying to copy me, but people are providing their own spin on things, their own flair, and that's fantastic. And it's a good thing for the industry overall. The more opinions that we have out there, the better for everybody. So it's certainly never a case of being a competition. At least I don't see it that way. I never see it as a competition between other content creators and myself. The more opinions out there, the better. But it's something that I'm very proud of, is the fact that I have been able to demonstrate that it is possible, and there now are other content creators that have been able to do the same thing. Just recently, Oscar from OC Racing has gone full time, as he announced, and he's absolutely killing it at the moment. He's doing an amazing job, pumping out so much content, and it's really exciting to see him growing an audience. And one of the things that I'm really happy about is that I'm able to be somewhat of a mentor to a lot of these guys. I talk regularly with Oscar. I talk regularly with quite a few other content creators as well. And, they don't need my help. That's not what I'm saying. But it's great to be able to have that relationship and, be able to share my experience, what I've learned, what I would do differently if I was starting again, and things like that. So, it's something that I take very seriously, and that's something that I'm very, very passionate about. But anyway, back to the point here. In the 7 years that I've been doing this now, the landscape has changed an awful lot, not only in the number of content creators that are doing it, but in the actual relationships with businesses and so forth. When I started, sim racing was still pretty small. It was primarily dominated by, relatively small companies, family-run businesses and so forth. So when we were dealing with them and, getting equipment into review and producing content and stuff, it was more like dealing with a bunch of mates really than it was, dealing with large corporations. And, if you look at the bigger tech industry, obviously that's big and corporate, and, sim racing has started to sort of move in that direction as well. So, back in the day, so to speak, the sim racing manufacturers generally were chomping at the bit to have somebody with a relatively large audience review their product. It made it very easy for me to say as a reviewer, these are my conditions, this is what we do, this is what we don't do, we don't accept money for reviews, blah, 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 all that stuff. And it was never really an issue. Occasionally there might be a bit of pushback, but we could generally resolve it amicably, and it wasn't an issue. As large corporations have started to work their way into sim racing, they have a lot of their own policies, so that's one thing. Oftentimes, and you guys might have seen a tweet that I just posted recently, I got an email from a company that actually isn't a sim racing company, but a larger tech company wanting me to review something. I'm not going to name names here because, again, it's not a witch hunt. It's it's an industry-wide trend. So it's a bigger issue than one company. But I received an email saying, we want to check the content before you post it. We want to approve it, so to speak. And it starts to you can see it starts to muddy the waters between what's a review and what's an endorsement. The worst one I've ever had was a company that wanted me to review something, and they actually said to me that if the review was positive, I could keep the product. And this was not a cheap product. This was a product that was worth multiple $1,000 US. And they said that I could keep it if I did a positive review, but if the review was negative, then they would ask for it back. So, they're not directly telling me that I have to say positive things, but they're incentivizing a positive review. And, to a business like what we're running here, the reality of the situation is I don't need any more sim racing gear. I am not in any way motivated at all by the accumulation of sim racing gear. In fact, it's actually a liability for me. I have to pay for storage. I have to pay for insurance. I just spent $250,000 Australian dollars on a massive warehouse to store everything, as you guys have seen. So, if I wasn't keeping stuff, I wouldn't have those expenses. And, it's crazy, but, those are the things that you have to do when you're operating as a business. So I hope that makes sense. But yeah, look, what we've found is that's one aspect of it. Companies are starting to be a lot more pushy with the terms that they put on reviews. And the other thing as well is now that there's large corporations involved that have their own marketing departments, oftentimes we're sent a reviewer's guide. And look, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Often it's it'll be like a PDF document with a basic rundown of the product, what the key selling points are, what the key features are and so forth, and, suggestions for how you might want to test the product to, obviously produce the best outcome for them. Now, I can only speak from my own perspective here. I actually don't mind receiving those. I don't see it as a problem. What it does for me is it allows me to have a guide as to what they think are the most important selling points of that product. So then I can make sure that I'm paying attention to those in addition to anything else that I would normally be paying attention to. So say, for example, a wheelbase comes out and it says specifically that, one of the selling points is that it has, something like USB pass-through, for example, that works on any steering wheel. I'm going to make damn sure that I test it with a massive variety of different steering wheels to make sure that that claim is accurate and true. But unfortunately, what I have noticed, and again, this isn't an accusation against any one particular reviewer, it's just a trend in general, is that, since these reviewer guides started to become more popular, it's very obvious sometimes when I'm watching other content on YouTube that all they're doing is really just reading off the review guide. It becomes abundantly clear, and I often, I cringe at it because I'm like, wow, I literally I can hold the document in front of me and I can just, it's almost word for word. So, in often cases as well, like these contracts that we often have to sign or negotiate, I can just tell when I'm watching the content. It's obvious to me that they've agreed to that original contract that had all those terms in it that aren't necessarily conducive to a review, but more like an endorsement. And that can be incredibly frustrating. And again, look, I'm not pointing the finger at anybody in particular here. It's a trend in general. There's thousands and thousands of people uploading reviews these days, and there's always going to be somebody that's doing these kinds of things. But you can see where I'm going with this. It's starting to become more and more of a problem as the pool gets bigger and there's more and more people doing this kind of content. So I thought it was important to, open up the discussion and make you guys aware that this is something that's starting to happen. So that's just a couple of changes that I've noticed in the landscape of sim racing hardware reviews, just in the last 7 years that I've been doing it. And I wanted you guys to be aware of that. I don't think that you guys are idiots, of course. I know you guys can think for yourselves, and I would hope that you can discern between something that's an endorsement and a review. And again, I don't want to be getting on a moral high ground here and preaching to you guys, but I think it is important that you guys are aware that that kind of thing does go on. Now, the other thing that's changed significantly in the last couple of years in particular is that it's now, for the first time ever, entirely feasible for a content creator to actually make a full-time living on YouTube or even Facebook videos or TikTok or whatever the platform, purely just from endorsing sim racing products. So we're seeing a lot of sponsorships starting to come into the fold now. And it's basically following suit from what we saw in the wider tech industry for probably the last 15 years or so. But we're finally starting to see it in the little niche that's sim racing, which is, in my opinion at least, great. I think that it's absolutely fantastic that content creators that put so much effort into their videos are actually able to make a full-time living from it. It means more content for you guys, more exposure to sim racing in general, and the more people we have, again, sharing their opinions on products from a reviewer perspective, the better, in my opinion. So I personally have absolutely no issue at all with anybody being sponsored, so to speak. But where I start to have some concerns, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is, and again, I want to hear from you guys what you think about this too. This is just my opinion, but where I start to have some personal issues with it is when the lines start to get blurred, like as we were saying before, between what's a review and what's an endorsement. And in particular, content creators that chop and change between the two different pathways. So, for example, one moment you might be watching a review video and maybe it's the first video you've seen from that particular content creator, and it is a genuine review of a product that, either they've been sent for review or they've, purchased themselves or whatever. But, it is a genuine review. And then the next time you see that content creator, you might actually be watching an endorsement of a product that they're actually being paid to produce for the manufacturer or reseller or whoever. And as a viewer, if it's not abundantly clear exactly what the context of that video is, if the previous video that you saw was a review, you're going to assume that the video that you're watching now is also a review. And if it isn't, and if it isn't clearly disclosed, you're not going to be getting the proper context as a viewer to understand that what you're watching is actually a paid endorsement of that product rather than a product review. So that's the two areas of concern that I wanted to address in this video. Firstly, the issue of large corporate companies coming into sim racing and potentially starting to push their weight around, push some muscle into the industry, and try to have a little bit more influence than they potentially should. And as a new content creator, it is all very new and exciting, and it is you feel like you don't have the ability to push back. You feel like you kind of have to do what they say. What I want to say to anybody that's producing sim racing content is, understand your value. Understand that they need you more than you need them. There's always going to be somebody else that is going to send you a product to review, or you can purchase something yourself, or maybe somebody will loan you something to review, and so forth. So never get trapped into feeling like you have to do what they say, otherwise you're never going to get anywhere. In the long run, you've got to play the long game, and you've got to always keep the audience as your priority. If you're not making content to serve your audience, then you're just not going to get anywhere. So that is the most important thing the most important piece of advice that I could give to anybody looking at making content, or anybody that's already making content and looking to try to make a proper thing of it. So there's a couple of things that I just wanted to quickly say that have been on my mind for quite some time. So one of them is, and I've written these down in my notes here. So as a content creator, if it's not abundantly obvious to your viewer that they're watching an endorsement within the first few minutes of the video, then you're simply just not doing your job well enough. There's no excuse for the viewer not understanding exactly what the context is of what they're watching, very early on in the content before the body of content starts. And, the very vague guidelines that are in place in terms of, laws around this kind of thing, disclosure and so forth, do state that it has to be abundantly clear in the body of the content itself. So not as a link in the description or anything like that. You have to actually tell your audience, and you have to make a reasonable attempt at ensuring that your audience is aware that something, what the nature of the video is. So if it's an endorsement, you have to say so. If you've received anything of monetary value in exchange for producing the content, you have to disclose that. And it's as simple as that. And unfortunately, and this isn't a sim racing problem, this is just a tech industry problem in general. There's nowhere near enough regulation around this stuff. People are able to get away with, just blatantly not disclosing at all. And, that's something that I have a massive problem with. So if you are a content creator, please make sure that you're making it abundantly clear to your audience, what exactly is the nature of the content that you're producing. And that way there's no ambiguity. They know what they're dealing with and they can judge accordingly. And along the lines of that, another thing that I wanted to say is that it's not a reviewer's job to convince you that they're unbiased. It's the reviewer's job to disclose any potential source of bias so that the viewer, you guys, can make your own decisions. So, I see far too often reviewers, and again, this is, across the entire review industry, not just sim racing specific, but I see reviewers saying, blah, 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 this was sent to me for free, but that doesn't mean that I'm biased. That doesn't mean, it's almost like they're trying to justify it to themselves or make excuses for the way that they've acquired the gear or whatever. Don't. You don't need to do that. All you need to do is just honestly disclose anything that could be seen as a potential source of bias so that the audience is aware of that and then they can make their own judgment. And you are going to have some people that are going to click off straight away as soon as they hear that you got the goods for free, and that's fine. If they don't trust your content, you don't want them watching your content in the first place. So, just one other little piece of advice to anybody who might be producing content. So, I think for me that's generally a pretty good way to judge whether a review is genuine or not. In general, my yardstick is if their disclosure feels more like a disclaimer, then I generally have a little bit more trouble trusting the content from that point on. But that's just me. Let me know what you guys think about that in the comments down below as well. But yeah, don't try to convince your viewers that you're not biased. Let them know any potential source of bias so they can make up their own mind. And it's as simple as that. Now, the last thought that I wanted to leave you guys with is the good old saying that if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. And it doesn't matter how unbiased you are as a reviewer. At the end of the day, anytime that a manufacturer or a reseller or anybody is giving a reviewer a product to review, what they're looking for is exposure. They want their product to be seen by as many eyes as possible, and they're taking the risk. They're taking the risk if it's a review rather than an endorsement. We really hope that this reviewer thinks that the product is a good one. But don't be fooled into thinking that it's anything other than that. At the end of the day, if you're not paying for the product, you are the product, and that's always the way it's going to be with reviews. You need to accept that, and the bigger you become as a creator, the more clout you have, so to speak, the easier it becomes to sort of start to push back. But in those early stages, it is really hard, but you do just have to stick to your guns. You do have to stand by what you believe is right, and that will mean that you will miss out on some opportunities. And it's as simple as that. If as the channel grows big enough, it will get to the point eventually where it's almost assumed that if a new product's coming out, XYZ reviewer will have a review of that product, and if they don't, then people start to ask questions as to why that particular reviewer hasn't reviewed a certain product. And we've certainly seen that kind of thing before as well. So I'll leave it at that, guys. Really interested to hear what you think about this as well. But I just wanted to say, going into the whole hype thing that you're going to see around the ADAC Expo, it's amazing that we're seeing all these new products, and it's fantastic that there's so much more money in sim racing now, which means more innovation, more choice for the consumer. These are all good things. But at the same time, we do just need to be a little bit cautious of how we're consuming content. We need to make sure that we are able to trust the content that we're watching and that we're looking at it through objective eyes at all times. So to just finish off here, I wanted to say thank you to you guys for keeping the industry accountable. It's something that it can be very stressful at times when you wake up in the morning and there's some Reddit thread with everybody going off about reviews being untrustworthy. I've lost a lot of sleep over that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, it is really important that you guys as viewers who, rely on content like ours to know what's going on in the scene are keeping the scene accountable. So yeah, thank you from the bottom of my heart for all the opportunities that you've given me as a reviewer. I never would have imagined that I would be in the position that I am now. It's a dream come true for me, and I absolutely love my job 7 years down the line. But do continue to keep the industry accountable. And yeah, guys, enjoy the conference if you're going there. Let us know what you think about all the products that are being released. Don't go too crazy with the old wallet. And yeah, I'll see you guys on the other side. Bye.